Before I start posting my early Final Fantasy XIV replay series, I wanted to rewind a bit further than most people usually do. If you've played and you started with A Realm Reborn, then you were dropped into a world that had already survived something catastrophic. This is clear in the beginning if you pay attention to the early quests and the early NPC dialogue. The game knows it, the characters know it. There's plenty of exposition in the beginning to give you a glimpse into it. But most players don't know the full story. And I think a lot of players have some inkling of it because, the rebirth of Final Fantasy XIV is common knowledge. But I wanted to go back and revisit that a little bit before my series starts, so we have a little bit of background on what the vantage point that we're starting from is. When Final Fantasy XIV originally launched in 2010, it had a very specific vision. It wasn't trying to be a fast-paced MMO. They designed it to be slower, more deliberate, more grounded than most of what was out there. The game expected you to spend time immersing yourself in the world instead of just rushing through it. Visually, it aimed pretty high. The environments were dense, the lighting was dramatic, and the character models were pushed pretty hard for the hardware that we had available at the time. You could see the intent there to make it a prestige Final Fantasy title first and an MMO second. That design philosophy didn't just come out of thin air. And a lot of that makes more sense if you remember what Square Enix's last MMO success actually was. Final Fantasy XI was slow, demanding, and very deliberately social. It asked players to learn very complex systems, depend on each other, and treat the world with the kind of seriousness that worked when it was in its heyday. And I don't want to say it doesn't work now, because Final Fantasy XI still has a very dedicated fan base to this day, which is amazing. But by the time Final Fantasy XIV was launching in 2010, most MMOs had moved away from that kind of idea. You can feel Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 trying to carry forward that vibe with a bit of smoothing. It had less forced grouping, more solo playability, and while the world still demanded patience from the players, it didn't lock you out of everything if you didn't have the right party makeup. In Final Fantasy XI, especially back in the day, not so much now, but in Final Fantasy XI's heyday, you couldn't level your character without a party. Or if you could, it was very, very slow. The problem is that this middle ground they were trying to achieve with 1.0 of 14 didn't really exist. For the players coming from 11, everything felt very simplified, overly simplified. And then from players coming from elsewhere who weren't familiar with 11, maybe from something like World of Warcraft, for example, it felt needlessly complicated even with the smoothing of its edges. It shaped the story the game wanted to tell. The important thing to understand about the Final Fantasy XIV story in 1.0 is that it wasn't ever meant to be about a world at peace. Eorzea was already unstable. The city-states were politically fragmented. They were distrustful of one another, and they were also still dealing with the shadow of the Garlean Empire looming over them and pressing in from the north. There were economic conflicts, territorial ones, ideological ones, and your character wasn't positioned as this legendary savior from the beginning. You were a capable adventurer, moving through an already tense world and just taking work where you could find it. And along the way, you began to earn the trust of Eorzea's people, and slowly became involved in larger problems. One of the central ideas of the story was that the history of Eorzea wouldn't stay buried. Ancient powers weren't myths. There were primals, forgotten technology, long-sealed threats that people were actively poking at. often just for short-term gain, and those decisions were already starting to catch up to them by the time we were thrown into the world. And above all of this, above this world that we were thrown into, was Dalamud, a red moon hanging in the sky. Ominous, but distant. It was just kind of background decoration until it wasn't. Over time, characters started to acknowledge it, scholars began to argue about it, militaries even planned around it. There was a real sense that something was wrong, but it was the kind of dread that grew very slowly. We never got to finish this story. Final Fantasy XIV's 1.0 story wasn't ever completed. There were major threads left unresolved. Some characters disappeared from the narrative entirely. Entire arcs that were clearly meant to escalate further just fizzled out. The game didn't fail after the story ended, it failed in the middle. And that matters because it explains why the ending was designed the way it was. The calamity wasn't the conclusion of a completed universe. It wasn't some epic climax of a war-torn world that had been written early into the game development. It was a decision made when it became clear that the game couldn't continue as it was. The story had to stop there, but the world didn't. I talked about the ambition of this game, the visuals, the character models, the immersion that they were going for. This approach wasn't wrong in theory, but the problem was that every one of those pieces came with trade-offs that the game could not afford. Large sections of the map reused the same terrain assets over and over. The world felt unfinished in a way that broke the immersion that they had been so desperately trying to encourage. The interface fought you constantly. Basic actions required way more steps than they needed to. Crafting was deep, but so deep that it crossed the line into busy work that felt too much like a chore. None of the things that were wrong with 1.0 were fatal flaws on their own. Plenty of MMOs have launched with awkward interfaces, questionable pacing, bugs. But under the hood, the real problems were growing. The game engine made iteration slow. Fixes took a lot of time. Even small changes were very expensive for the studio to implement. So while players were giving feedback, the game wasn't improving fast enough or in a meaningful enough way that it was earning their goodwill back. At a certain point, it had gone far past polishing the rough edges, and it was unclear if the foundation could even support the improvement needed. Eventually, Square did something you almost never see at this scale. They publicly admitted that the game was not meeting expectations. They changed leadership. They got a new producer, Naoki Yoshida, and he came in with a very specific job just to stabilize the game, support the players, the ones still around, and more importantly, buy some time. What was critical here is that it was never framed as some miracle turnaround. They were realistic about what the problems were, what could be done about them, and what just couldn't. And that honesty was a big step toward building this trust back. That same honesty carried over into the story itself. Instead of resetting the world of Eorzea, Final Fantasy XIV chose to let the world end, sort of. Dalamud, that ominous moon looming over the story for months, was finally addressed directly. What it actually was, why it existed, and what would happen if it fell. The Battle of Carteneau wasn't a cutscene players could watch. We could actually log into the world and watch in real time as it burned. Cities were attacked, NPCs fought, failed, and fell. The sky broke open before our eyes. When Bahamut was unleashed, it wasn't a battle we could win. It wasn't even a battle we had a chance at winning. It was a disaster. And the people of Eorzea couldn't overcome that. They sounded the retreat, and then the servers went dark. The spectacle of it doesn't matter, and there was plenty of it, and I think it's very important to talk about because of how interesting it was that they chose to do it this way. But what matters is the intent behind it. Square Enix let players be present for the destruction of the world they'd spent all this time trying to learn and love. They weren't the heroes that stopped the calamity, because the calamity couldn't be stopped, but they were there to bear witness. When the game returned as Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn in 2014, it didn't pretend that this original version of the game never happened. It didn't shy away from the failure. The world was actually reshaped. People remembered what was lost. Nations acknowledged that they had survived something traumatic. Even the silence in certain places felt intentional. A Realm Reborn didn't treat the calamity as a backstory because it wasn't. It was the recent history of their world. And the aftermath is still being felt when you arrive as a brand new adventurer in your city-state of choice. A Realm Reborn is often criticized for being slow, safe, or overly cautious. And all of those things are true. I'll be the first one to suggest that a new player spend the money to buy the story skip, because it is a slog, it is slow, and it is painful in the beginning, especially now, starting today, more than 10 years later, when things have been optimized and it seems unnecessary, the lengths that you have to go to get from the A Realm Reborn story into the rest of the game. It is slow. That said, at the time, it had to be. The game was rebuilding trust with players, its developers, with its own world in a way. When you understand what came before this, when you understand what happened in the first iteration of this game, it's easier to understand how purposeful that restraint was in building up this story slowly. That's why I wanted to start here. I'm not just replaying A Realm Reborn for the nostalgia, though there definitely is that. I went into this because it's been a long time since I played the original story, and I don't remember much of it, but I know it's important, and I want to relive it. And I'm taking you along with me, if you'd like to be a part of it too. So with that context in place, we can finally go back to the beginning of A Realm Reborn, armed with the understanding of why it starts the way it does. The next video in this series is where the replay actually begins, and I'll be badly voice acting all of the non-voice acted parts for anyone who just wants to throw it on a second screen and listen without actually paying attention, so there's that. I just wanted to explain the world that had to end before the realm could be reborn.